I've been learning a lot at this conference, so I'm excited to jump in on the discussion by telling you about the work we've been doing to characterize Earth analogs with reflected light. I'd also like to thank Chris and Nick for setting up a lot of the background for me. So here we have a contrast, planet-to-star contrast ratio versus separation for direct imaging missions. Over here you can see the current known self-luminous giant planets. That's where we are now. And then in the future, with WFIRST and its coronagraph, we're hoping to characterize some of the known radial velocity planets and discover more of those. And on the bottom, these are the solar system planets placed at 10 parsecs. And as Chris was describing, star shades can help us push down the contrast even further and hopefully get us to image exo-Earths. And mission concepts like HabEx and LUVOIR are also hoping to do that. And these missions are proposed for the decadal survey, which we want to know about the kinds of science that we can do with these missions. And so my group and I developed this inverse modeling framework that uses Bayesian parameter estimation to try and see how well we can constrain these interesting quantities given the data that we might get. And so I'll talk about the model and the approach. I'll highlight some of the findings that we have in the paper that you can find on the archive, and I will talk about some of the work that's going on right now. So what can we learn about the Earth using reflected light? Here we have an image taken by satellite of Earth. Next to it is a model by Ty Robinson that replicates a lot of what we see in those data, and then what we can do is integrate these patches up into a reflected light spectrum, and you can see from the near ultraviolet to the mid-infrared that there are plenty of features that we can study. And for our first study, we focused on the visible light. So let's zoom in on that. Here you have geometric albedo versus wavelength, and you can see that there's a Rayleigh scattering slope primarily due to nitrogen. There's water absorption, ozone absorption, and oxygen. But in reality, when we actually get spectra, they're going to be lower in resolution and they're going to be noisy. And so here we have that same spectrum, but now it's at a resolution of 70 with a signal to noise, or SNR, of 20. And you can see a lot of these features are already starting to be lost in the noise. And so the question is, when we actually get data and they have a certain quality that goes along with them, what can we actually robustly infer about the planetary environment? And that's where atmospheric retrievals come in. And so the idea with that, it's also called inverse modeling, where we have a parameterized forward model that is able to generate a high resolution spectrum, and we can degrade that spectrum to simulate data that, say, HabEx or LUVOIR or WFIRST might be able to observe, and then we compare it to our actual observed spectrum, and we evaluate a goodness of fit using a likelihood function in a Bayesian framework. And since we don't actually have observed spectra, we're going to create the mock spectra that we compare to in our retrievals. And so for each parameter, we're going to have a prior distribution that we're going to use an MCMC algorithm to sample from until we go through this loop again and again, trying out different combinations so that we can construct a posterior probability distribution for each of those parameters that's in our forward model. And what we can do, since we're generating the mock spectra, is we can change up the resolution, change up the signal to noise ratios, and then we can see how that impacts our posterior distributions. And so let's see what that looks like. In our first study, we considered 3 cases: WFIRST, which will have photometric points plus a spectrum, and then we did a case that goes from 0.4 to 1 microns at RF 70, and another case at RF 140. And for each of those cases, we looked at data from SNR 5 all the way through 20. And here I've highlighted how well we detected some quantities like planetary radius, surface pressure, oxygen, ozone, and water. And so where there's blank spaces, that means there was no detection, or the posterior distribution is just flat. And then weak detection means that there is a peak in the posterior distribution, but there are tail extreme values that are also probable. And then the darker green color is a detection where there's no longer extreme values at the tails, but the precision of the constraint, the precision of the posterior distribution is wide enough such, for example, for water, it would be larger than an order of magnitude. And then for a constraint over here, that means it's a peaked posterior distribution, and the 1 sigma error bars are precise enough. And so you can see as a function of, as we go to higher signal to noises and higher resolutions, we get better constraints. And speaking of these posterior distributions, here I've shown water, ozone, and oxygen, and this is showing how we can compare. If we fix a signal to noise ratio, we can see how the different instruments can perform. And this is telling us that if we want to be able to detect these 3 important molecular species for an Earth-like planet, we would need to go to a higher resolution of R of 140. And so in all our cases, we didn't translate signal to noise to exposure time. We were basically saying, say, we just get these data as they are. Let's see what we can find from them. And this is to show that retrievals are a really useful tool to quantify what we can learn from these spectra and also quantitatively support choices we make in designing our missions. And so for every retrieval model, the core of it would have to be the forward model. And so that's what I'm going to describe here. Essentially, we're looking at a visible hemisphere that's divided up into a bunch of patches, each of which is a column of atmosphere. And for each column, we perform radiative transfer and scattering calculations, and then we integrate up all those reflected fluxes so that we can get albedo as a function of wavelength. And on the right side, you can see all of the retrieves parameters in our models, including all the gases. We also have a water cloud, and we also prescribe a fractional cloudiness parameter across our visible disk. And there are also bulk quantities like surface albedo, which we just say is a constant wavelength independent value for now, and then gravity and planetary radius. And the key with retrievals is that the forward model needs to run in just on the order of seconds so that we can use statistical sampling and call on it hundreds and thousands of times. And so we need to do a lot of simplifying assumptions, including assuming that we know what the semi-major axis is, and we assume that the abundances throughout the atmosphere is constant. But we did include pressure-dependent opacities as we're exploring a wide range of pressure space. And so for our first study, we stuck mainly to the visible. And here, current ongoing work, we're working on getting out into the near infrared. And here you can see that's where we get access to methane features as well as carbon dioxide features and more water features. And at Earth levels, in the near infrared, this is where we can start seeing carbon dioxide and methane features. And so here I have a spectrum from the LUVOIR interim report of modern Earth abundance values and what that looks like going from the near ultraviolet to the infrared. And you can see that these are some of the features that we could gain when we go out into the near infrared. And so let's take a look at what that looks like. Ooh, that's fine. When we use our model to create it. So we divided up that wavelength range into 3 chunks, the ultraviolet, the visible. The ultraviolet is at a low resolution, the visible is at a higher resolution, 140, which is what we studied as well in the first study, and then the near infrared is a lower resolution chunk. And the question we want to ask is, what do we gain by adding this extra near infrared chunk? But this is all very preliminary work. What we're going to do is we're going to fix the signal to noise in those first 2 regimes, and then we're going to vary the signal to noise in the near infrared, going from low signal to noise all the way up to match what we have in the optical. And I'm working with this with a post-bac student, Adam Smith. And this is super duper preliminary because the noise that we use is all wavelength independent, and going forwards, we definitely want to include a more realistic noise model. Okay, so let's see what we have. For this is just showing the visible results. This is the posterior distribution for water when it's at R of 140 and SNR of 15. And next, I'm going to show you what happens when we add the near infrared. And you can see that the main difference is there's much better precision. And what's also interesting to note is that all three cases that we studied for the near-infrared data, going from SNR of 5 to 10 to 15, these posterior distributions all seem to lie on top of each other, which tells us that we could get away with lower signal-to-noise in the near-infrared. Let's take a look at some other interesting molecular species, and I'm just focusing on the gases for this talk. And you can see for ozone and oxygen as well, it's a similar story where we get better precision, but there's not much change for the signal-to-noise ratio. But what the near-infrared adds for us is access to carbon dioxide and methane, and so let's take a look at what happens there. And so on the left, we have the methane posterior distributions for all the three near-infrared cases, and you can see that we just get an upper limit. And then when it comes to carbon dioxide, this is where it gets a little bit interesting in that finally there's a little bit more of a dependence on the signal to noise. And you can see if we do actually want to detect weakly carbon dioxide, we would need to go to a higher signal to noise ratio. And again, I want to bring up the fact that we use wavelength independent noise. And so depending on what the instrument looks like in terms of the noise that's out there in the near infrared, it might even mess up our ability to detect carbon dioxide for Earth values even more. And so as I start to wrap up, I just wanted to put up this really cool figure also from the LUVOIR interim report, which goes through a flow down process of what we want when we see another planet, all the way going down to learning more about a potentially Earth-like planet. And there's going to be decisions that need to be made for every single one of these questions. And for my group and our work, we definitely just want to see how we can help quantify some of these thresholds for the answers to these questions. And so to conclude, I've described a framework that we've developed using Bayesian parameter estimation that helps us quantify, given a certain type of data, how well we can constrain quantities that we would be interested in for Earth-like planets. And then I've shown you what happens when we add extra data in the near infrared. And finally, moving forward, we're definitely excited to incorporate different types of atmospheres, going from super Earths to mini Neptunes, so we can celebrate the diversity of all the planets that we study. Thanks for your attention.
We have time for a few questions.
How do you get abundances and not just whether the molecule is there or not? Because you need to know the pressure of whatever your background is, like nitrogen. Mm-hmm. And I remember that there was some debate in hot Jupiters that you don't even know that there. So how would you get that here? Is it something about the Rayleigh scattering slope that gives you that information, or
for the background gas?
Yeah,
or
like how many nitrogen molecules you have in the background to actually know what's the relative abundance of H2O.
Mm-hmm. So for our case, since we were doing an Earth-like planet, we assumed that it was nitrogen, but we let that be a free parameter so that when we retrieve for water and oxygen, ozone, nitrogen is 1 minus whatever is left over. But if we're thinking of other types of planets, we're going to retrieve for the background gas as a free parameter. So it could be hydrogen or something else. But nitrogen is a likely inert background gas for terrestrial planets.
Okay, but do you happen to know what actually is the physical thing inside the spectrum that actually tells you how much nitrogen there is?
Yes.
Because you're not getting the effect, you're not seeing individual lines.
Right, so that would be like you were saying, the Rayleigh scattering slope. That is primarily due to the nitrogen, and that reflects in the surface pressure as well.
Another thing that really affects your ability to retrieve things is, using a Bayesian system, is your assumption for the prior and the first guess and how close the final answer was to that. And I was a little bit concerned about that when I saw your relative insensitivity to signal to noise. What are you assuming for your prior and your a priori covariance and your first guess in these calculations?
So for all our priors, we just assume it's a uniform distribution or log uniform. to be as agnostic as possible.
So it's a completely agnostic prior. And then you have to use a first guess?
No, it depends on what sampler you use, but usually the idea is that the sampler has enough time to just sort of completely forget about where it came from so that it can fully explore the posterior distribution.
And is your retrieval a simultaneous retrieval, so you pull all the gases out at once? Okay.
Yes, it's
Rather than
a
sequential.
simultaneous.
Okay.